Well, we're here this afternoon, and definitely what I like to do is just first to get to the core of this, have an icebreaker. What I like to do is I like to go around and pretty much, since we now have a panel of 6, excluding myself, I would just like pretty much in about a minute, just going, you just giving your initial views on this subject matter of supranational economic unions and entrepreneurship as a key to stabilizing African economies and promoting prosperity. And if we could keep it in a minute, so everybody would have pretty much a flavor of where you are with this. You may not be an expert, but at least some kind of idea of what you think about it. So we'll first start with Ms. Halima.
Thank you very much, Chair. Probably being an African, I might use 3 minutes. I would like to start by saying that on this topic, we need the why, the who, and how, and way forward. Why do we need to have stabilization, etc., for entrepreneurship? As we are all aware that governments can no longer sustain to employ people. For example, you have a lot of school leavers that are from university that cannot get into the formal job sector. When I went to university in the 80s in Kenya, it was guaranteed that when you finished university, you got a job. But right now, that doesn't happen. So we need to find alternative sources of employment. And you have rising youth unemployment and underemployment. Sometimes people have jobs, but those jobs are not, beasts of burden. I don't know how to put it any differently, but by having so many unemployed youths, it's also very dangerous for security. You remember yesterday the Secretary of Gender from Kenya, she talked about during the election violence, that there was a lot of, what happened in Kenya, it's because there were so many youth for hire, as it were. Yes, there was ethnicity, negative ethnicity, but when you don't have takers, these people were paid very little money, actually less than $10 to go and do whatever they did. So basically, to stabilize your economy, you need to redistribute the gains. So we always talk about economic and social development, but that's not enough, and I'll get back to that since I don't have so many meetings. Skills demand not keeping up with what is needed. The educational system, basically, African educational system, we all want to be lawyers, doctors, etc. But we don't think of entrepreneurship. IT is coming in, so the syllabus needs to be changed. That the private sector industry needs to be involved in the syllabus setting, in the training, etc. Maybe the US Silicon Valley that you have hubs, etc. That's what would be needed. I would come back since I don't have so many meetings, but I'd like to talk a little bit about way forward. How this can be done. Member states, you have the regional economic communities, RECs, then you have UN agencies, because we are talking about supranational agencies. What needs to be done and what's the way forward? I'll get back to this, and I'll finish off with trade, access to markets, since this was brought up, the WTO negotiations. Thank you, but I think I'll come back to this since my 3 minutes are over. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Mrs. Halima. Daniel, I would ask the same question again, just to get a flavor where everybody is on it, because taking Dr. Kennedy's whole, and for those of you who are here for Dr. Kennedy's presentation, he virtually had this analogy about the pig, and he had the different size when a biologist sees a pig, when a kid sees a pig, when a painter, when a photographer. So I'm trying to use the same kind of model in this discussion. So you would have different views on the same subject matter, but it's to be able to engage or to template those views, because those, as you sit in the audience, you may have different perspectives on the same, and you may be able to draw links of the conversation through the views which are presented from the panelists. So Daniel, again, with you traveling throughout Africa and also being here, much more being a journalist, what would be your view from a journalistic position, but also from somebody who is not of African heritage, but who has been in Africa and worked on the ground in Africa?
I actually would like to narrate a very short story of a lady I happened to stumble across in South Sudan last year when I was there on a research trip, and I think who is a very good symbol for the question that we are talking about. The lady is called Rose. She's 40, 41, 42 years old, and she has 4 children to feed. And the oldest one is 20, and the youngest one is, I think, something like 5 or 6. The husband left her when they were in a refugee camp in Kenya. And now she's back in South Sudan, in a region with no infrastructure, no paved roads or anything. And she has to feed her children. She has to push them to school because she believes, quite rightfully, that education is the only way that they'll have a better future. And she's unskilled. And she participated in a program of a German NGO. And they said, we can give you a microcredit loan, but you have to come up with a business idea first. And so she traveled to Uganda and bought foodstuffs, peas and carrots and maize and everything, because in South Sudan it's mainly subsistence farming. People don't sell, they just grow. But she realized there are people who want to also buy foodstuffs because they don't have time to farm themselves or because they don't make enough but have other sources of income. So she traveled across, bought a bag of each, came back to South Sudan, sold it in the market, was so successful that she had the money to go back, buy the next load, this time in a bigger quantity, go back to South Sudan and so on. So she's managing to feed her children and push them through school, but the problem is it's not really a success story, it's a positive story. But the problem is she's an entrepreneur who has no experience in running a business, who is barely literate, who does not know how she could expand her business. So that's where now all the challenges as far as entrepreneurship are concerned are coming in. And the other problem is that it's not an open border. You can travel across, but you need to show your ID. You might need to bribe a border official because he is having a bad day and he has not seen a salary in 6 months and he has also children to feed. So you have a problem, you have a bad need for a supernatural economic union there, because in that case, Rose could buy whatever she wanted to and could carry it to Sudan, could sell it. She would spend less and she would earn more, and that in turn would give her a higher income. And she could maybe not even take care of her 4 children, but also maybe of those orphan children of her relatives, sister or brother, I don't remember, who passed away in the war, and who also need a breadwinner in the family. So I think that example that was just happened to stumble across, and I was walking the market and looking for people I could talk to, shows very well the challenges that we have, but already the potential and the positive examples, although they're very small, but the positive examples that we are seeing in this field today.
Dr. Kennedy, I'd like to at least raise the threshold in regards to yourself, because I know you do this every day. First, if you can put, because every word actually has a contextual locus, a contextual center. So I'd like you to place supranational and entrepreneurship in terms of this discussion of the rise of Africa. Because if you're talking about entrepreneurship like Daniel has just explained, in the context of you've got to go border controls, paper and others, it's a different kind of entrepreneurship as you do in Berlin. So first, let's deal with supranational. What would your definition of supranational be in terms of the rise of Africa? And also entrepreneurship, because I feel they're keys to understanding the dialogue as a whole.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very difficult question for me to try to put it into perspective. But my background approaching the definition is economic ethics, and looking at this. From Daniel's example, let's continue. This lady, the national and cross-border organizations are existing. You have it's ECOWAS or whatever you call them, they are there. Even when we don't have them, Africans travel across the borders. I mean, somebody asked me, am I Nigerian or am I Cameroonian? I said, I don't know where I belong to, but I know I live with Nigerians. Most of the shopping issues has been done. Am I a Zimbabwean or a South African or a Lesotho or a Basutu or whatever? We have all these organizations there, but as he rightly said, we have some of the functional efficiency of these organizations is missing. We don't question them. And the facilitations of cross-border trading is also missing as an entrepreneur. Secondly, it's easy for somebody to travel from Europe to South Africa than to leave Kenya to South Africa. Sometimes you have to leave Kenya. Kenya is the other examples. Let's take, I had one of my students that she has to leave and one of these North Arabian countries, let me see, not Egypt, Tunisia, sorry. She had to fly to Rome, and from Rome get Ethiopian Airways, fly to Addis Ababa, and from Addis Ababa she could get the connections to Congo, and from Congo she goes to Angola. So you have to see, even though when you have entrepreneurs at the cross-border regional area and you don't have the mechanisms that allows entrepreneurs, and this is called transaction cost. What is the opportunity cost of not you taking all these roads and and finding an easy way just to deal with the European? That's why it's very easy for some African businessmen to go and buy goods from China and supply it there. Now, let me go to the supranational bodies. This is where we have a serious trouble. They are fundamental elements to foster entrepreneurship. If and only if entrepreneurship is seen as the ability of individuals, be it in politics or in the commercial sections or civil society, to see problems as challenges and see challenges as opportunities, and from these opportunities create products out of it. And at the same time, for political entrepreneurs there, they are entrepreneurs that find ways to increase their re-election, but not at the same time compromising with the dignity of its citizens. So this is the type of ethical entrepreneurship I look at. So with supranational organizations, we have a trouble here because when we deal with the negotiations at the European Union's and the African Union's issue, I mean, we need to improve the economic department of the African Union, which is now NEPAD. The new partnership for the economic liberalizations, renaissance of Africa, as I want to use the South African term of it, it's very important. But secondly, when African government deals with supranational organizations, just look at Brussels. We were discussing about this morning. We have a lot of experts. It's a countries within a country, policymakers researching and providing information to continue the harmonizations of the European Economic Union process. But when you get into the NEPAD office in Pretoria, which I was there, it's terrible. It's about not up to 100 people struggling there with different sectors, and from the 100 people, you have 80% of those researchers on civil society issues. So this is where we have imbalances in getting competencies of the supranational organizations, as well as having having a harmonization process when African governments negotiate with other strong partners. We don't have it. If we had it during the Economic Partnership Agreement, some countries couldn't have withdrawn and allow for bilateral negotiation when African bodies said we need to negotiate on trade liberalization process so that we can produce goods in agricultural products from different African countries and sell it, so that we can allow African entrepreneurs, when they produce their good, they can sell into Europe. At the same time, so that we can reduce the cost of remittances, because this is a debate that the individuals cannot do. We can reduce the cost of remittances. For every $5 you transfer on Western Union, you pay a certain charges. So this is a development fund, but if you have a supranational body that debates on a percentage of these charges should be sent into a fund that is being used in doing the harmonization process. So when you put supranational process and entrepreneurship, for me, they are preconditions for economic development in Africa.
Thank you very much. I'll move straight to my very dear friend, met in June. You had an excellent presentation on the potential of Africa. And I remember when we first met, actually, I was sitting in the front where Prince was, and as he was having the presentation, I was like on the edge, and he says, well, just calm down, let me finish, let me get to my point. Because when I get to my point, then you'll realize I'm covering the scope. But you did show Africa in a different light in terms of potential, and that's what you presented. So pretty much the capacity for prosperity is there. But do you think that the components of the supranational economic union and entrepreneurship are part of the key factors to it, to stabilizing it?
Yes, does it work? No. It works?
No. Sir.
No.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I think it is a key. Of course, the supranational organizations, unions. But first of all, we have to see that Africa is not a homogeneous continent. There are big differences, and therefore, even actually, you gave 1 minute for the first statement.
I did.
Okay.
I realize that I'm taking notes.
And therefore, the supranational unions organization will be a very important factor for the future in Africa. For example, if we see a country like Republic of South Africa, which is already called as a NIC country, that means a newly industrialized country. It's the only country in Africa which has this standard already. Of course, relations with the neighbor countries will have an impact on the economy of these countries. Yes, that's why I think it will be very important to improve especially regional developments. That means if you have a strong partner, a strong neighbor, it also will affect your country. The other point is when we talk about stabilize the economy in Africa, then we also have to consider that the level of the economy in Africa is very low right now. That means maybe we should do a little bit more than stabilize it. So that means we have right now, since year 2009, 1 billion, a population of 1 billion in Africa. In 2050 the perspective is that in Africa will live more than 2 billion people, and 2060 every third human being on this planet will be of African descent. On the other hand, we have resources, enormous resources, and I'm not sure it was in 2008 or 2009, but China invested in 2008, I guess, 55 billion euro in Africa. So that means also what the moderator mentioned, that on the one hand we have a problem of poverty and people think of small business. On the other hand, we have a big business. 50% of all gold reserves of the world are on the African continent. And we have coltan. It's actually it only exists in Africa. So that means resources are there, humans are there, the population is there. So therefore, we have to focus in the African nations to build up, like some countries did in Northern Africa and also in South Africa. Good government, good governance. We have to strengthen democratic movements. That means right now, my fear is that we have from China, of course, money, but also we would call it in the Western world the dictatorships. And sometimes they meet our politicians, which are, like my father's from Cameroon, I'm Cameroonian too. We are always number one in Transparency International corruption list. So that means it is also very dangerous right now if we see the standard that our nations are right now. Thank you.
Well, since you mentioned South Africa, I would do this. I'll go past my next panel member, Dr. Kharziel, and I'll go straight to South Africa, because I think it's very interesting if we're talking about a newly industrial NIC, newly industrial country. And maybe that would hold a key to the discussion of the rise of Africa, because if we can have some parallels which show that in the practice, and it now getting the great labeling as a newly industrial country, and pretty much in the paradigm right now, everybody wants to become developed, which industrialization and good economics comes. Maybe South Africa can speak to it, because pretty much we would say that if they've got there, then it might be the model for everybody. So we'll ask South Africa to maybe give some kind of insight into how this plays into the question of this key to stabilizing African economies and promoting prosperity, entrepreneurship, and supranational economic unions.
Thank you. I've prepared a statement which I can just read out to you, which I think will answer some of your questions. So I just wanted to say thank you for this invitation to speak on the issue of supranational economic unions and entrepreneurship as a key to stabilizing African economies and promoting prosperity at this conference. This is a very important topic for African countries as we seek to ensure the continued development of the African continent. As South Africans, we view our struggle for a better life of our people closely intertwined with our struggle for a better Africa and a better world. We believe the era of African approach to international relations has arrived. Africa will no longer be a peripheral role player or receiver of donor aid. And South Africa is conscious of our role in playing our part to ensure that our continent and our people are respected, our voices heard, and our concerns are given attention. In looking at the importance of supranational economic unions for the development of Africa, it's important to examine continental and regional initiatives to deepen political and economic integration in the continent. In 1999, the heads of state and government of the Organization of African Unity issued a declaration called the Sirte Declaration, calling for the establishment of an African Union, with a view inter alia to accelerating the process of integration in the continent, to enable it to play its rightful role in the global economy, while addressing multifaceted social, economic, and political problems that are compounded by certain negative aspects of globalization. At the Durban Summit in 2002, the Organization of African Unity launched the African Union and convened the first assembly of the heads of states of the African Union. The new Partnership for Africa's Development has been adopted by the African Union as Africa's principal agenda for development, providing a holistic, comprehensive, integrated strategic framework for the socio-economic development of the continent within the institutional framework of the African Union. The primary objective of NEPAD is to eradicate poverty in Africa and to place African countries both individually and collectively on a path of sustainable growth and development, and to halt the marginalization of Africa in the globalization process. A key component of furthering the integration of the continent is the establishment of regional economic organizations. The African Union has recognized 8 regional economic communities as officially representative regional organizations of African states. These 8 regional economic communities have been set up pursuant to the treaty relating to the establishment of the African Economic Community of 1991. The following regional organizations have been recognized by the decision of the AU's Assembly of Heads of State and Government, namely the Arab Maghreb Union, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, the Community of Saharan States, the East African Community, the Economic Community of Central African States, the Economic Community of West African States, the Intergovernmental Authority for Development, and the Southern African Development Community. South Africa is a member of the Southern African Development Community, and I will therefore focus on this regional organization. Currently, SADC comprises 50 member states, namely Angola, Botswana, the DRC, Lesotho, Madagascar, Malawi, Mauritius, Mozambique, Namibia, Seychelles, South Africa, Swaziland, United Republic of Tanzania, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. The SADC mission is to promote sustainable and equitable economic growth and socio-economic development through efficient, productive systems, deeper cooperation and integration, good governance, and durable peace and security, so that the region emerges as a competitive and effective player in international relations and the world economy. The regional indicative strategic development plan remains the framework for the SADC regional integration that provides SADC's member states with a consistent and comprehensive program of long-term economic and social policies. In March 2001, the heads of state and government met at an extraordinary summit in Windhoek and adopted the Regional Indicative Strategic Development Plan, which reaffirms the commitment of SADC member states to good political, economic, and corporate governance entrenched in a culture of democracy, full participation by civil society, transparency, and the respect for the rule of law. In this context, the African Union's NEPAD program is embedded as a credible and relevant continental framework, and the RISDP as SADC's regional expression and vehicle for achieving the ideals contained therein. The summit of SADC heads of state and government held from August 16 to 17, 2008 in South Africa launched the SADC Free Trade Area, which is the first milestone in the regional economic integration agenda. The summit recognized that free trade in the region will create a larger market, releasing potential for trade, economic development, and employment creation. The SADC regional integration program also includes the establishment of a customs union, a common market by 2015, a monetary union by 2016, and a single currency by 2018. While regional and continental integration are important means of promoting development, the issue of entrepreneurship remains an important factor in the promotion of economic growth in African countries. In the case of South Africa, the small business sector is economically significant, with approximately 2 million small businesses representing 98% of the total number of firms in the country. Collectively, small enterprises employ 55% of the country's labor force and contribute approximately 42% to the total country's wage bill. However, 87% of the small enterprises are survivalist, the great majority black-owned, of which 41% are owned by women. These trends are very significant as they starkly illustrate both the potential and challenges for small business growth. The challenge for South Africa is to provide an enabling environment which will allow the 86% of survivalist businesses to graduate to stable businesses. Entrepreneurship combines persistence and imagination, driving the innovation that often leads to knowledge and discovery of opportunities. Currently, too many of our emerging entrepreneurs are not able to further and develop and use these skills. A challenge for South Africa remains that emerging entrepreneurs also often remain marginal to accessing opportunities in finance. This is the context for our emphasis on enterprise development, focusing on the small and medium sector, the micro enterprise sector, as well as cooperatives. Cross-cutting of all of these is our focus on women empowerment. We are of the view that individual entrepreneurs can bring about enormous changes in an economy through new ideas and competitive offerings, which are technology intensive. We will therefore continue to provide technology support measures for small and medium micro enterprises. In Africa, there's a great need for entrepreneurship and greater leadership and managerial ability in the private sector, as well as in the non-governmental sphere. Few development experts will deny that at some point developing countries need to transition away from a reliance on foreign aid towards an economy supported by a sustainable business sector. An area where Africa has been constrained over the years is the missing middle of entrepreneurship. These are companies which are made up of entrepreneurs that are above the micro enterprise level, but below the large level. For Africa, integration and the importance of supranational, continental, and regional organizations, as well as entrepreneurship, are key areas in promoting the continued development of the continent. Well, we are of the view that Africa will assume its rightful place as an important actor in the community of nations, and that Africa will achieve the goal of ensuring a better life for its people in the coming decades.
Thank you very much. Just if you could hold the mic over there, I'd like you to go back on a point. You said South Africa is setting an environment to provide, is it 6% you had a figure related over?
86% of 86% of our small businesses. That's what I said here. To provide an enabling environment for 86% of our small businesses to graduate to stable businesses.
Okay, thank you very much. 86%. Okay. That's why I asked the question again, because I was wondering if in all this, as a newly industrial country, if the environment was just to provide for 6%, I was wondering what's happening to the...
I'm sorry if I wasn't clear.
To 94%, so I had to go back on that. But coming to Dr. Kharziel Ben Yehuda, Dean of the Institute for Regenerative Truth in Israel, the university over there. You virtually you come through the background of people who left a thriving, quote-unquote, economy after 400 years being in the United States of America. And you chose to go into one of the most hostile real estates upon the face of the earth and then participate in the reconstruction of Africa. So you virtually moved from what I won't call it so much economic development, but you took another framework of entrepreneurship. And I'm only going to ask this question because I want to eke out of you. Since we ask, and remember it was in a question form, is it a key to the stabilizing of African economies and promoting prosperity? And you are part of a group that left out of the Western world to come into Africa. It looks like everybody, and again, Comrade Sandile, everybody tries to leave from Africa, brain drain, and go to the Western world. But you did the reverse. So in the light of what's happening in the Northern Hemisphere, because if we are to get any kind of models of stabilizing and providing prosperity, the Northern Hemisphere would be very great in providing that in terms of supernatural economies, etc., etc. So would you relate that these are just the components, or I would broach it a little further. In your move and in you being a dean and teaching people how to impact as transformers of a society, do you feel it's the economic structure, whether it's entrepreneurship or supranational, or do you feel that outside the academic disciplines, there is a flaw in how people use these particular things, which, I mean, and I'm only just saying it, you can be a good driver, but if you're a good driver and you're always drunk, then as much as you had your license, you're still going to crash, because it doesn't make sense. So this is where I'm trying to get to, because we're looking at if you do get the economy right, you would get prosperity. So what do you see in this in terms of the human factor in this? Because it does relate to this.
Thank you. I would like to first Thank the membership, the leadership of the ICD for having me here. Very humbled, very excited, and very honored to be in the midst of such distinguished brothers and sisters, men and women. First of all, I'm glad you asked that question, Brother Yoshafat, because I'm very, very passionate about the rise of Africa. And I think that these ideals here, in terms of supranational economics, prosperity, they can be realities in Africa. However, we must find the correct roadmap to reach these realities. Because if you're in Berlin and you're trying to find your way, but you have a map of London, I don't care how passionate you be about this map. I don't care how much time you put in trying to figure it out, how intelligent you are, how well you've been prepared. But if you have a map of London trying to find your way through Berlin, you're going to fail. That's the reality, that's truth. And so I think what we need to do, we need to take advantage of this ideal of the new African century, and we need to stop. We need to stop. And we need to face the reality that the Eurocentric idea will not work in Africa. And if you listen to most of the presentations that are given, even the last panel discussion, fundamentally everyone was speaking in terms of how to make Europe fit in Africa. But what about the indigenous knowledge systems of Africa prior to the advent of the Eurocentric idea? I wrote a paper that was presented to a group of educators in Rio de Janeiro, and it was called Moving from Euro-Literacy to Afro-Literacy. And I spoke about the flaw in the human spirit. I agree profoundly with the former president of Yugoslavia, Klavel. And when he looked at the state of the earth at this time, he said it was a profound flaw in the human spirit. That was very interesting. Stood out, very dynamic, because when we look at the realities that we face, we conclude that what Africa needs is a new social philosophy, a new idea. And I'd like to read something just to show you what I mean. This is written by an African intellectual by the name of Mbigi Lovemore. He said, Africa has knowledge and expertise predating colonial times, spanning the fields of management, governance, philosophy, religion, astrology, agriculture, architecture, health, craft, science, technology, building, and industry. However, colonial laws and policies undermined, discredited, and the legitimacy of African indigenous knowledge systems. Western education and religion, too, were used to undermine our indigenous knowledge systems by defining them as primitive and satanic. Those educated in Western schools were taught to reject their own indigenous knowledge and look down on it with contempt. Nevertheless, indigenous knowledge continued to be transmitted orally among the peasants through rituals and ceremonies, and retained its hold on the life of the majority of contemporary Africans. So really only a small segment of African society has been touched by Eurocentrism. And unfortunately, those are in the most important areas. Back to Lovemore. African indigenous knowledge and expertise are still predominant in the organic, holistic African worldview, characterized by the independent values of Ubuntu, Brother Kennedy, meaning I am because we are. And I'll end there because, and I'll probably, hopefully I can say more as we go on, But the fact is, we need to redefine economics that's not predisposed to the Eurocentric idea, because, I mean, it just will not work. And so as we proceed on, again, we need a new philosophy, and we must, and this is not new to Africa. What I'm saying is we must not be afraid to step back and revive our ideal of economics and prosperity and wealth before we had been totally influenced and overwhelmed by the Euro literacy, Eurocentric ideals of these things.
Well, thank you very much. I then can move. Now we've got everybody pretty warmed up with the expanded 1 minute gap before I bring everyone else in. Let's just go straight to this before Mr. Halima. Let's first take this point from the European idea won't work. But I'd like to take a counter view to that, because if we take the EU, it is a supranational organization and has a much longer history and experience. So are there matters in which the African Union might model itself on this success story, knowing the experience it's had pretty much from 1957 coming together, the steel coal union which started before? And should they be based on mutual collaboration and partnership, or rather focused, as we had before, on competition? Because there were two schools of thought as to cooperation and competition. But first, we're trying to come off from the threshold of the Eurocentric idea won't work in Africa. But then again, maybe possibly so, we've never had, maybe possibly so, we've never had what you would call a supranational traditional system of Africa, which spans across before 1884, which has involved all Africa's interaction in regards to resources management and economy. So the only one we have in current modalities will be the EU. So if we're using that as an example, and we're using the same vernacular, would it be something that would have advantages that we can draw from, or would it still speak to what Dr. Kharziel is speaking, that it really doesn't have a place in terms of our paradigm and our prosperity?
Thank you very much. I think what I would say for the African Union to model itself on the EU would be both advantageous and disadvantageous, because there are things that work and things don't work. I would give you the example that when it comes to harmonization of policies, having bigger markets, market integration, that would work. But why Africa integration hasn't worked, we've put too much emphasis on politics. Maybe that's the Eurocentrism education I did get. I think now I'm getting into, we need to bake a cake, a big cake to share, something like that. And I think Africa, right now, we are going in the right direction. We have harmonization of regional economic communities. You have the EAC, SADC, and COMESA coming up with an FTA together, so having the same common external tariff. You are going to have a regional trade facilitation facility for these same regions, that you're going to have common pool of energy, infrastructure. Then you have actually also the North-South corridor. This is what we are calling it these days, the corridor development, etc. That we realized, yes, Africa has taken off, but there are things we need to put in place. And what we need to put in place is infrastructure, both hard and soft. So for example, the North-South corridor starts from Dar es Salaam, ends in South Africa. But going back to your question, I think the EU would work and not work because the same point of the Eurocentrism, that they came together coming up from a different perspective. So we have also a different way of looking at things. But for us, it's also, we need to come together, for example, for political purposes, being, having been taken advantage of for very many years. Coming together gives us bargaining strength that we have used very effectively. We are talking about the rise of Africa. Next century is going to be Africa's century, and everything is in place in terms of human resources, in terms of wealth. For example, if I give you good, positive things that are coming out of Africa, then I'll get back to the question as well. You have the East African community that has expanded into 5. Rwanda and Burundi now are EAC member states. You have actually Congo going to join the EAC. We are waiting for the referendum. The Sudanese, South Sudan has also indicated they want to join the EAC, for example. Then you have all these activities going on. You have intra-Africa trade, though it's not as much as we would like, but there's a lot of intra-African investment going on. EcoBank was mentioned this morning. EcoBank has a presence in 28 member states. I don't have the figures with me, but tomorrow in my presentation, how much capital they have. You have Kenya, which is the biggest investor in Uganda, for example. Kenya is the biggest actually exporter to COMESA. The EU is number 2. So you can see we are becoming competitive. There are all these things taking place. But I think we got caught up in this Eurocentrism, that Europe looks at Africa with a certain lens, that we also look at it in that lens. And everybody, in fact, the person, is he called O'Neill, who came up with BRICS? He said, he has been talking about investment. You have a lot of venture capitalists actually in Africa. They've realized the biggest returns for stock exchange, et cetera, takes place in Africa. It's actually better to invest in Africa at the moment in financial services than to invest in Europe, for example. But what I would say, there's always positive and negatives, even as human beings. If you come to Germany as diaspora, as many of you are, there are good things you can pick out of Germany. For example, keeping time and discarding the 1 hour late scenario. It's the same as the EU. I think when it comes to rules and regulations, harmonization, we can use that, but there are some elements that we shouldn't take. So personally, what I would say is we go back to what we've been saying the last 2 days, that is the vision of Africa development first. Then from this vision, we can take the rules that we think can work, but we should not take hook, line, and sinker, things that work elsewhere, and think you cannot put an engine from a BMW and put in a Volkswagen and you think it will work. You have to adapt it to that situation. Thank you.
Wow, looks like we're into the zen of what you call the maintenance of the motorcycle or something. Now we're getting parallels in all these discussions. But anyway, going to that, I'll ask my brother over here. We're all witnesses again. We're just trying to still get into this internal makeup of African economies and the effects. Because now we have a knowledge-based system. We have what will work and won't work. And we're not being naive. Again, we are in Germany. I think Hegel is a German-based philosopher. So you always have this great Hegel thing of, well, if you always get into the crossroads, you always do this normal thing of thesis, antithesis, and you get a synthesis. So is there a possibility of it, or it's just one or the other? But just going straight to the point, we are witnesses of the progress of globalization, which can be explained as a stage of which internalization of economy and the increase of economic interdependence of states. What are the examples of the globalized African economy, and how does this influence traditional African economy? So we're looking at two things in terms of the progress of globalization. And again, definition is a stage of internalization of economy and the increase of economic interdependence. So two things, if you can help. You can take one, I'll pass the other to another person. But what are examples of globalized economy of Africa? Okay, we'll ask South Africa. Since South Africa is a newly industrialized country, possibly they could give us an example of the global African economy. And then I'll ask Dr. Kennedy, how does this influence traditional African economy? Because I'm trying to get to a point, right, we've just heard of economic entrepreneurship, which is affected by political. But is there a point where social entrepreneurship can virtually become the glue to bring everything back into balance? Because again, it's entrepreneurship, but it deals with another kind of product. And I've crafted that one. So if you want to code that one, I'm crafting another paradigm, social entrepreneurship. So first, globalized African economy. Are there any examples of that?
I mean, yes. I mean, in terms of South Africa, we part of the global economy, and also, I mean, within our region, the SADC region. I mean, we are trading amongst ourselves, and so as a regional bloc, there's a regional market in terms of SADC. There are other regional blocks within Africa also that I mean, we see it as the building blocks to a eventual Union of African States, you know, as an African Union, using the regional economic communities to build greater unity on the continent. So, I mean, but as an economy, South Africa is a newly industrialized economy, yes, but we're a mixture of first and third world economies also. We have a developed economy and sort of a second economy that is largely undeveloped. First world economy that in our country has all the elements of a first world economy. But we have the challenge of the so-called second economy, which we field which represents the majority of our people, which we are trying to bring into to develop, to bring them into this first economy. So we have this dichotomy in our country, or the split, which is a legacy of our past, and we are looking at ways of development that bridges this gap. So yes, we are a newly industrialized economy, but we're a globalized economy. We trade with the rest of the world. Many aspects of it are first world, but we have some third world aspects, and yeah.
If I may, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but if I may, are you saying in event of the dichotomy, we're not talking about a globalization in terms of our interaction with the outside world, but a globalization in terms of the internal affairs of African economy? And
That's
would
right.
you, in your statement, would you say, even at the stage where we now are an NIC, we cannot actually give an example of a globalized internal African economy?
Okay.
Now, I'm just asking you.
Me. Okay.
I'm not putting you on the spot. There may not be an example, but I'm just trying to bring it to the form, because sometimes these words are put up, and either there is or there isn't, because it's very essential to the discussion if we're able to see some examples or we don't have. Again, going on the roadmap, because we might be thinking we're going to Berlin, but we might be ending up in London. So I just want to find out if at this point where we have made an NIC, do we have some of the first fruits? And again, being an agrarian people, the harvest was always determined by the quality of the first crop which came. This is part of African metaphor. So do we have some of those crops? I mean, we didn't check it by the prototype of the Mercedes-Benz or the BMW. It was how good the orange or the tomato was. So do we have something in terms of our globalized structure that can speak that our first country, which is the first fruit, is part of that? If anyone can help us on that.
I'd like to take that one. No, there isn't any. There really isn't any. In terms of sustaining a people, a continent of people, there is no really any comparison. My brother here, I first like to applaud the achievements that has been made in South Africa. Extraordinary. But when you place that in front of the reality of where this global ideal of economics, where it lies, Africa doesn't even come into the idea of it all. You can type out the word Eurocentric on your Microsoft computer, and it will give you the word as a word, Eurocentric. But type out Afrocentric, it'll say misspelled. You'd have to hyphenate it in order for it to work. That means we're not even in the world. There's not an idea of this African in its purest indigenous idea in that world. Only Africans that have been nurtured within the Eurocentric idea. That's one. And I don't want to sound like a doomsday prophet or pessimistic. I think Africa, I agree with my brother here, Africa is at one of its greatest moments in history, but we have to realize what needs to be done at this point. You see, that's very important. For example, give you a good example. The Western world, they have overdeveloped. They've developed into what we can call irrelevancy, to the point where they're dumping automobiles into the ocean because they've made too many. And we can go on and on and on and on about how they have developed out of what's reality. So much that they've brought humanity to a very, very dangerous point. They've destroyed the air, the water, and the whole ideal of wholesome food. So sociologists and philosophers, they say now, in order for the West to continue, they have to underdevelop, because success has actually become their great demise. So they say that, for example, they have developed to 100, but in order to sustain, they must undevelop down to 25. Other than that, they could just go into oblivion. Africa, just the opposite. And I think the Prince made a great statement when he said Africa has been preserved you know. So, and just like Mbegi said, Lovemore, the point he made about this indigenous knowledge actually being the very large component of the indigenous people of Africa. Africa is at 25. And it may seem like, wow, it's so far behind, but we're really not. Because in order for us to get to 25, we don't have to traverse that much space. They have to come down from 100.
If I may ask, you
Please.
said Africa's at 25.
25.
So in order for us to get to 25, that means we would not have moved.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I just
Africa's
trying to
at-
make sure I heard
thank
that
you,
right.
Thank you. No, he's corrected me. He's just-
Okay,
Africa's at, say, maybe 5.
okay.
5% of development. So in order for us to get to 25, we don't have to traverse as far a distance. So really, Africa is an advanced continent because, like my brother pointed out, the resources are still there. Sometimes I ask my students, back to pinpointing your point about this global economy, I ask, name me one product that is produced in Africa and disseminated throughout the world. There's none, you know. As a matter of fact, just take England and Japan, you know, it's countless things. The problem is these are islands, little bitty islands. Africa is a massive continent and don't produce not one single item that's utilized as, say, maybe a daily product that's essential to get by.
If you can hold your point over there, because there were two advocates of examples of a globalized economy in Africa. And right after this, I would start to engage again the audience, because at least you now know the trend of the panel discussion as it goes. So if you may, I would like to get straight to you, if you can hold your point over there, in regards to the globalized internal African economy, which you said exists, examples, and how does this influence traditional African economy? So I'll take Dr. Kennedy first.
Well, as much as I agree with a lot of points on the training, creating an indigenous African entrepreneurial mindset, his mindset, not entrepreneurship, because in Africa we have entrepreneurs all over. Just move around the street of Lagos. Look at all these guys drop out from schools. They don't have a business plan, but they have a plan to do their business. They buy things and sell. Look at the lady there. We have this entrepreneurial mindset.
Are you trying to then say that this mode, or this non-traditional mode of African entrepreneurship could be another way forward, and everything doesn't have to be formal as we've been taught?
Exactly. The issue is we have it, one of the things we are trying to do at the African Business Information Bank is to formalize the informal sector. We have to tap this indigenous knowledge at the informal sector. We were told and trained to ignore them. But the issue is when you calculate the GDP in Africa, it's terrible because we do not actually account for all the trade, the velocity of trade that happens every day. When ladies buy tomatoes from here and sell it there, we don't account for them. These are credible entrepreneurs. Some of them can't read. I was telling somebody we had women that leaves African countries, travel to China, buy goods, come back. They don't speak Chinese, but those ladies never went to school. They can't read. The hostesses have to explain them everything and how to even to read the numbers of their seats. But they travel to China and buy goods, speaking, and come back. So we have this entrepreneurship. But let me get to the point. We need to understand something. We have companies like MTN, South African telecommunication companies, that have been, they understood the idea of harnessing traditional African values, but translating it into a modern economic system. That is why MTN outkicked the European company in Cameroon by taking the villages first as their partner, selling cell phones, appliances to their villages. But the villagers, knowing that the villagers could not pay for the cost, but when they went to the cities, they knew all those who can pay sit in the city. And once the villagers get the SIM card, all those in the city automatically get the SIM card. This is where you use traditional African strategies for entrepreneurship. But let me take your social entrepreneurship. This is something you will get in the next months to come. It is out there. You call them social business models, social entrepreneurship, putting socials in everything. But in the core sense of it, it's not about entrepreneurship. It's about survival. It's not about creativity. It's not about harnessing Africans' indigenous issues. Therefore, what we have to do is to go back to the traditional Africans' ways of doing business. Look at it. How do we formalize it? My formalization is not creating structure out of it, but how do we enable them to create more jobs? Not jobs for the family, but jobs for competent people. So when we start harnessing traditional entrepreneurship ideas, and using existing technology to support it, because technology reduces transaction cost. And so when we harness it, then we create people-centered entrepreneurial development. So it's not about entrepreneurial development for the financial sector, but people-centered entrepreneurial development. And this is the only strategy where we can preserve traditional African institutional structure.
Thank you very much. You actually went straight into my second question, but what I'm going to do now, because of time, is we have a gist of where this discussion is going. Okay, if you can hold your example, let me first field 3 questions from the audience, and then in between that you can weave those. And definitely we have my brother Daniel, so if we can take some questions, 3 questions from the audience. If you can, again, to try to get to your point, my question is, so if we have any in the audience, while we're waiting for the audience, you can definitely go on ahead, and while we're waiting for the audience to come.
Thank you very much. I'm embarrassed to give examples of this because our brother from South Africa actually already said they have 2 economies. They have first world economy and third world economy. In addition to MTN, you have De Beers. You have Castle. That's a very good beers. It's exported even this sides. Tusker as well, actually. You have Stanbic Bank, for example. So basically you have those. But the trouble is, who owns these companies at the end of it all? So maybe if you lift the curtain, as lawyers say, ownership then is not with black Africans. Ownership is with other people. But basically, if we are going by country, South Africa has a number of multinationals that are out there. That's the example I wanted to give, actually.
Okay, I'll still stimulate it further. The African Union was established in 2002, and it consists of almost all African states except Morocco. So every time you hear the African Union, there's one African state on the continent of Africa which is not included in the African Union, and that's Morocco. Its main goals, the African Union, are to accelerate the political and social economic integration of the continent, to promote and defend African common positions on issues of interest to the continent and its people, achieve peace and security in Africa, and to promote democratic institutions, good governance, and human rights. Which of those purposes may be considered as almost achieved, and which of them still needs to be worked out? I know, Danny, when we're coming on and you said you didn't like my smile, but since you're a journalist, this was where my smile came into it, because the journalists, especially, I live in London. I was getting ready to say I'm from London. I live in London. I flew from London, but I'm not from London, if you understand. But I just wanted to make that point. I do live in London. I work there. But as a journalist, Fleet Street did a marvelous job in fashioning the psychological perception of Africa. And I'm not saying you're from Fleet Street, but it virtually was part of the bedrock of media interpretation. So looking from the lens of a journalist, the question then to you would be, you see African Union, you've got the template of the European Union. And the final question would be, which of these purposes of the African Union, as is on paper, would you consider as a journalist almost achieved, or which needs to be worked on? I'm only saying it because we just had this morning this whole thing about, you remember Brand Africa? And the journalists have a lot of impact because the Prince talked about the inside-out perception. So this is the outside in, and I couldn't choose anyone much more better to speak on this than you, Daniel.
Thank you very much. But first of all, please let me correct you on one point, because that's very important. I never said that I wouldn't like your smile. I said, please don't say anything because your smile says it all, because you were about to make a point and I knew which point you were making and I didn't want to hear it. So
you're absolutely right.
Just to make that very clear. I think with the African Union, it's actually a very mixed picture for me. I find it very positive that the African Union is trying to take certain steps to address issues. For instance, trying to bring peace and security to Darfur by having a military presence on the ground. Same in Somalia. That's now the intention. But on the practical level, we see, of course, there's a lack of resources, a lack of experience, and also sometimes, in my view, also it becomes very difficult for African leaders to overcome this very old principle of non-interference in their neighbors' affairs. So now they want to say something, they want to interfere, but in the back of their minds, it seems to me they still think, oh, but I shouldn't really be doing this, and isn't there any way out? And so I think it is a very bold step. I'm glad that the African Union was founded. I'm glad also that they want to work on an economic integration of the continent, that they want to improve human rights, peace and security, but I feel it's a really very long road until the AU will really be a working and effective body. But at least the steps are going, in my opinion, in the right direction.
Okay. If there are any questions, there's one question over there, 2, 3. If you can help us, because I know we're pushing the borders of time, so if you can stand up, make your point. My question is, my comment is, Doctor, please, you're the first one.
My question is, supranational economic unions and entrepreneurship as a key to stabilizing African economies and promoting prosperity. I want to ask, considering the ownership of these companies or organizations in Africa, and the fact that the ownership is not, or the ownerships are not indigenous, what role does capital flight, repatriation of proceeds from this business back to the owners' countries, what role does that play in promoting prosperity in Africa? If you make all the money in Africa, you take it back home. We have serious problems in Nigeria. Shell, Chevron, this, that, all of them, they make the money goes back to their mother organization. How do we reconcile that? And we're talking about stabilizing African economies and promoting prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I've got a question to Dr. Kennedy. Actually, you said that I agree with you when you say that we should promote indigenous knowledge in terms of entrepreneurship in Africa. But actually, there has been many social youth entrepreneurs who have made who participated a lot in the development of rural African countries. According to you, is social entrepreneurship promoting prosperity in Africa or not?
Okay. Thank you very much. The third one.
Yes, I had posed a question in the last panel discussion. I didn't get a response. Had this panel been conducted 50 years ago, we would have heard from many African leaders ideas about alternative economic systems. Let's be clear on what's being said or what's being implied here. I just want some clarity on a few points. What economic system or what economic form are people suggesting here should be perpetuated, or should be instituted, or should be created? Also, in conjunction with the statement about not necessarily emulating other systems, such as the colonial systems that were placed upon the colonies. Keeping in mind that if we take capitalism, for instance, that system was developed here in Europe and imposed upon the people here and then exported to to the colonies. Now, there was another statement that was made. You see, there are certain things. There's a universality of a contradiction, and there's a particularity of a contradiction. And for instance, the laws of physics apply everywhere on the planet and throughout the universe. However, certain cultural customs vary from place to place on the planet. I just want to make sure that we keep in mind that there are certain things that are universal and certain things that are particular to a situation. So I just like somebody just to really, or everyone, to just to speak out about what economic system are we talking about here? Thank you.
Okay, so your question is, what economic system are we talking about in the context of this conversation? Now I'm just getting that's the question.
Yeah, and then perhaps, as an addendum, what, and really I must express my ignorance here right now. I don't know what economic system is being professed by the South African government or any of these governments per se. Are they coming out and saying they're this system or that system? Let's get some clarity on that, and I think that must be defined or at least cleared up so we can talk intelligently about what it is we're trying to do here.
Well, again, in the spirit of the professor from Kenya yesterday, she said we should always, even in contentious issues, keep the dialogue going. So since you actually put South Africa on the spot, I would go back to South Africa. Maybe they can kickstart this as to the economic system, and then we could roll it through.
In terms of the economic system, I mean, in South Africa, we have a free market economy. We recognize that, especially in post-1994, when we had our first elections, that we're part of a globalized world economy, and that we had to integrate into a global world economy. So we didn't. So debates about issues like nationalization in our country were largely put to the back. Recently, the issue of nationalization has become an issue of debate in our country. We have talked about it, about nationalization, respect of minds, and that kind of thing. But that is purely a debate. Our government policy is that we are a free market economy, globalized, part of the global world economy, and that we have to trade and with the rest of the world, and we have to be an open economy. So that's our economic model at present.
Thank you very much. Again, we have the question of how does the cash flight out of the countries from where it is made into the mother countries or the stakeholder countries help to promote it as a key to stabilizing African economies, from the doctor, and also the question of how does social entrepreneurship promote prosperity? If that's right in framing your question.
He said it's better to promote indigenous indigenous knowledge of entrepreneurship instead of using social entrepreneurship. That's what you said, exactly, or yeah. And because social entrepreneurship does not promote creativity and so on and so forth. I think that social entrepreneurship can be used as to promote the African prosperity, because it concerns the society. They work for the society, and it has been successful. And nowadays there are more and more youth social entrepreneurs in the country, and I think it can work.
Just if I may, to your question, I could add also to this particular thing, that what are the general guidelines for successful entrepreneurs in Africa, and what are the opportunities and roadblocks that the cultural, economic, social, political, and fiscal environments provide for entrepreneurs in Africa? If I may, to support your question, that will be to Dr. Kennedy.
Yes, that is a legitimate question, and I believe I still stand to the point that social entrepreneurship, the way it is being propagated, is not the best fit model to continue, to get to where we have to go, to make use of the different competencies. It's just one of the little ones. And social entrepreneurship, according to the model I presented 2 days ago, was closer to humanitarian issues, right? It's closer to humanitarian issues. Means when we have NGOs and humanitarian issues, and when people move from from the bottom of the economic pyramid, we have to use humanitarian organizations to move them into social entrepreneurs. But that is not the point. I would like many youths in Africa to move into re-entrepreneurship, opening company, and creating job. And this is the point where I say we have to climb this poverty eradication product metrics. If we have everybody on NGOs, you said, okay, let's move into social entrepreneurship. The social entrepreneurship, let me just explain to you what it means. If we use the Muhammad Yunus definition of social entrepreneurship and social business model, it means if you make profit, you operate as a business. You make profit, but you reinvest this profit back into the business. So it's just like reinvesting the profit. You don't pay out shareholders dividends in the moment, but you keep it reinvesting to target social issues. It's fine. But where do we take these people on the next level? They need to get into small and medium-sized enterprises like what we have in the Bavaria, in Germany, like what we have and what runs most of the Western economy. At that point, I could say yes. But what are the preconditions for Africa? I would just make it straight. The precondition for sustainable entrepreneurship. Well, the others we all commonly agree to it, good governance or whatever you call it. They are true, but in the real sense of it, it is an ideology of good governance. It's just one of it. But one of the issues you need now in Africa is credible information. I need to sit in Tanzania and know which are my credible partners in Malawi. I need to sit in Nigeria and I know which of those guys are not, which of the information I'm getting out, which of the information I'm receiving is credible or not. So if we don't have credible information, then you can't have credible partnership. So these are some of the preconditions. You need finance, of course. You will get microfinance, but microfinance is a social business model, but it's not a model to develop a country. It's one of the little part to kickstart, where while you're having educational processes, capacity buildings. But what we need to do that will create innovations in the 21st century, I support Dr. Kharziel here, is getting into our indigenous African knowledge. This is where we have our USP, unique selling proposition, whatever you call it, or point. But when you look at it, because why is it? My father was a traditional medical doctor, a traditional doctor. And where he made it was this. He used traditional African medicine and combined it with modern medicine, but he never started from modern medicine to combine African medicine. And he developed possibilities of using simple plants, medicinal plants, to solve problems. And to the greatest of our surprise, we had Europeans migrating and spending 4 years sitting beside him, learning how he actually, solves some of the simple diseases like I call it simple traumatized and psychological problems. But he himself was an entrepreneur because he was able to look at the missing link. Traditional African medicine was seen like, we were trained not to use it. But he was able to communicate and use it in such a way that it adds value to the existing products out there. That is why, for me, social entrepreneurs and traditional African indigenous ideas should be combined, but not to stay there, but to move to the next level and also sell our ideas to the world. Timbuktu, that's a great place. I mean, when Alexander went to Timbuktu, he was surprised to see there were documents written and science were all taught there. But if you go back to Mali and most of these countries, they don't look at this as a great place to create new museums, create, modern museums, modern arts museum to pull and sell African idea. This is the next level that I want young Africans to get in, not social entrepreneurship, but real entrepreneurship.
Just before you go off the point, and I'm not going to let you off on this, I think that's a very, very good presentation, a first-class presentation, and it's a very big but. We're talking about an entrepreneur, and then we're talking about a successful entrepreneur, and you've spoken about two things, that they need to reinvest into the business. So taking your father, how does he reinvest into the business? The second factor is, what is a successful entrepreneur? Because if you're talking about humanitarian, what then defines a successful entrepreneur? Would GlaxoSmithKline be considered as a successful entrepreneur if he reinvests his gains back into the business to make drugs which may have side effects on people, but he's not giving it to the stakeholder, he is reinvesting into the business? Because the definition of what is a successful entrepreneur has got to be commensurate with an Africa which can rise. Do you all understand? Otherwise, we can then talk about Bill Gates and 3 men on the world who have more money than all of Africa combined, but then you've got poverty. They've got more money than they can use, but then you've got people who don't even have one decent meal a day. But he's a successful entrepreneur. Is that the kind of model which would be the key to stabilizing prosperity in Africa?
Well, I think the financial crisis in the past year just proved that that model doesn't work, and it's based on its unique African philosophy. If you take all the richness and all the food in the market and take it to your house, you are indirectly inviting everybody to come for dinner at your house. 2 ways, either through the doors or through the windows. So these are the only way, and when it happens, so you can't afford to get everything for yourself. So what does that mean? That is why I made mention of the traditional African Ubuntu principles. I am my brother's keeper, and every businessman deals with this. Every marketing student will know customers is the most priority of our offices, or whatever you call it, our business. But it means when I treat my peers, when I treat my customers, and hear the definition of an entrepreneur, what are my customers? Are they the immediate buyers of my products? Or are they the immediate buyers of my products, the governments, the communities, and so on? And this is where the Africans' ideas of entrepreneurship comes in. It's not the individual itself, but it's the ability of the entrepreneurs to rise, but at the same time creating platform for other individuals to rise. So this type of entrepreneurship is based on the same fundamental values that the Japanese economy grew upon, which the German economy grew upon. And philosophers like Schumpeter or Max Weber, Max Weber said the capitalism is the precondition, a Protestant ethic is a precondition for capitalist economy. He was wrong when in Japan, you suddenly saw the Japanese economy also growing. He said, but they don't have the Protestant ethic. But he was right in one thing, and the thing was the value of community cooperating. The Protestant ethics calls for individualism, and at the same time, but the community of Young in Japan calls for dedicating resources and competencies within your confined environment. So they use it within companies, within interaction pattern, but in Africa we don't have this. Because we believe that it's your community relationship for you to, it's your moral right. I mean, exploited African thinking. It's your moral right to help me. Whether I have, they have, and they have not. And at the same time, you have the limit of using your competencies and distributing it to the whole village.
Hold your point there. Daniel, you've actually been, and I'm again saying from a young individual to now as a professional, and you've been actually on the ground in Africa. And as a journalist, you speak every day, you see these stories, and you have to craft these stories. So where does, and I'm not going to say what he's saying is rhetoric because he is a qualified professional, but where do you see this marrying in terms of what you see as a successful African entrepreneur, and much more one that can provide a key to stability in Africa, being around more than one country in your experience?
I would simply say a successful African entrepreneur, and I think it applies also to entrepreneurs in other continents that are poor, is someone who is able to achieve his immediate objectives, which is feeding his family, his children, or his wife or husband, if the other partner in the marriage does not have a job, preferably also paying school fees. So that is for me like a basic definition. Even better if the person is able to save a little bit of money in case the main breadwinner falls sick, because I've noticed that's a huge risk. You might have a family that is struggling but is living from hand to mouth, but the minute the breadwinner falls sick, and if it's just for a couple of weeks, he might lose his job or his business, and then the whole family slips even deeper into poverty. So for me, I would keep it that sweet and simple, and saying that for me is kind of the basic definition of what a successful entrepreneur is, because for me that's a huge achievement. If you manage in such a tough environment to feed your family And so for me, that is more is the same than somebody building up a company in a developed country that is then making millions of euro.
John, would you have anything to share on that point?
Maybe I would like first to say something to a question about the ownership of companies. Of course, I mean, it's up to every country, every nation to set the legal infrastructure. If you have a company in Germany, of course, you pay taxes. And Shell, of course, I don't know what they do with their profit in Germany, whether it goes to England. But anyway, it's up to the Nigerians, when it's their petrol, it's their oil, so to take part in this business. So this it shows a little bit a general problem in Africa. And the other point is, I think if we talk about entrepreneurship, we should also the perception. We talked about the Eurocentric perception of Africa. I mean, if you don't expect much, you are very far satisfied. And we talk about entrepreneurship, I would say, on a level here, which is, if we talk about the globalized world, which is not comparable with entrepreneurship in any other part of the world. So we talk about feeding, people. So actually, this is not entrepreneurship for me. Entrepreneurship is somebody who creates something. That means he produces something. It's even more than traveling to Dubai or to Singapore, buy something and sell, buy cheap and sell more expensive in Africa. It's the question is, if you have iron in your country, but all the things that you need to build a house, I mean not a house on the village, a real building. But you have iron, but you have to import all the things you need to construct a building. So that means there's no African country that is, except South Africa, that's able, I mean, to build a street. We have to find contractors, European, Asian, whatever. So that means entrepreneurship in Africa, for me, means to think about resources, human and also the other resources, and to take these resources and to produce something, because I think we don't produce much. What we produce I think in every African country is beer. So I think there are very successful African entrepreneurs in this sector. So, in Cameroon, I think we have more than 3 or 4 brasseries, and I would say this is successful African entrepreneurs, also in the tobacco industry, and we produce also something. MTN is a very interesting example, and I think we should also expect more from Africa than maybe others do. That means if we see the 21st century as the African century, then we also see entrepreneur that is somebody who wants to make money. And of course he reinvests, but before you reinvest, you also have to live. And that is why people become entrepreneur. And then we also have this level, and that is a very stable market in Africa. This is where people really do small businesses every day. They go out in the morning and they do it the whole day, and that's what everybody's doing. But we need also, but it's also an interesting remark. We can also talk about which kind of system we should have, for example. But I would also say we could think about a system when we produce something. Maybe it's always good to produce something. So then after we produce something, and that was also my problem when you asked me a question and I was thinking, globalized, who is really successful in the globalized world? And you said, okay, there's none. So then I could understand why I couldn't answer the question. But anyway, I see it very optimistic because the resources are there, and we should also expect much more of ourselves than maybe others do.
We're pretty much coming down to the end. We have a few moments, but what I like to do is, we still have the question of what happens to the capital flight, which leaves out of the countries, which is unanswered. But what I like to do is I like to pair it with the last 3 from the audience so that we could take that in and virtually, because some of these answers have an expanded commentary to them. So if we can take 3 more questions. Mr. Sandile.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'll just preface my questions now with a comment. If you look at the EU, it is a political project. And then even though the euro could be facing some challenges, but there is a strong determination to stay the course. So, which brings me to the following questions. Just looking at the manner in which, rather haphazard manner in which the African countries renegotiated the EPAs, to what extent are we prepared to make use of these supranational bodies? Then the other one goes to the question of sovereignty. How, as Africans, ready are we to cede our sovereignty to these supranational bodies? Because, I mean, for example, here is almost a common practice that there would be an EU position, and then the EU position takes precedence over the
national sovereignty.
Over the individual positions of member states. And then the other one, if you talk about entrepreneurship and then promoting prosperity, etc., key to that is free movement of people. And then in South Africa, we learned the hard way, and at times to our embarrassment as well, that our people are still not quite open to the idea of having entrepreneurs from other parts of the continent.
Are you talking in light of the xenophobic attacks from the family from Zimbabwe, etc., etc.? Okay, thanks.
So the question there is, how are we engaging the civil society?
Okay, so first, to what extent do these supranational bodies have over the African okay, how far we receive our sovereignty, and the free movement of people is key to this.
Okay. And then how are we engaging the civil society? How are we doing in that regard?
Okay.
And then lastly, we do have divergent views on the time frames. Brother Leader is very much keen to...
When you say brother leader, Muammar Gaddafi?
Yeah.
Okay, just one.
And then...
Because, you know, a lot of other Africans now have taken that frame of reference. There are so many brother leaders now, you know, so want to make sure which brother leader you're referring to.
But South Africa and others are adopting a much more pragmatic and incremental approach. So how much of a factor is that, and how are we managing that situation?
Could I ask you a question, since this thing, just real brief? Would it have something to do with our cultural rhythms and resonance, that each different cultural value has a different pace of how we do things? Where a brother leader maybe can't say, maybe in the Sahara Desert, you really have to get out of the sunshine into the shade very fast, so they move much more quickly. Whereby where you're in an area of trees, it's cool, so you can move much more gently. I'm just asking, because there may be a social, cultural, geographic effect on the pace being in that area. Over in Germany, it's cold in Romania and in Germany, so you virtually adapt to something which has a parallel all across the continent. But in Africa, you don't have, because you've got temperate, tropical, and this thing. So I'm just asking, you may not have an answer to it, but it may be relevant.
Just to reflect, I think there could be variations. I mean, when I was still at head office, so one of the countries that we had to engage with on the area of post-conflict reconstruction and development, but we could realize that we're moving at different paces. They had their own way of doing things, which was a slightly slower pace than what we anticipated.
Thank you very much. If there are just two more, or if that's it, okay.
Sorry, thanks. Quick question. Mine is on the link between the political situation and the economics that we've been talking about. As we've seen, it's crucial for African states to do commerce between each other before Europe or before China. But how is this possible when so many countries have ethnic conflicts or tribal conflicts or religious conflicts, as we've seen in, you see divisions in the political landscape. One party, one religion votes for one party and the other votes for another, or one tribe for one tribe for another. So if that's the case in some African countries, how can they think about doing business with one another when they don't even have, or they don't have yet, this unity of seeing themselves as one country doing business with another?
If I may expand on that, let me just ask a question before I put it to the panel. You posed a question. Let me just ask something. You did make a statement that Africa had virtually cross or intertrade before the colonial effect. And now, is that what you're trying to say? That they traded amongst one another before? They didn't.
How can they today think about commercing with one another when they still have problems such ethnic divides, tribal divides, religious divides that are so important that lead to violent conflicts?
Okay. Is there the third question?
Good afternoon. Is it working? Yeah. I would like to ask you if possibly there's a way to engage both the private sector and perhaps through the civil society, because you were saying that countries and donors, they need to sort of show to their people that what they're doing is right and they're meeting the immediate needs of people. But then again, if we're only going to stop by meeting the basic needs, we're never going to find a way to feed a greater amount of people and also being sustainable for the people without always needing the help. So my question is, maybe perhaps through the civil society, we can try to engage them in a way to they regulate how they're doing it. Perhaps I was thinking to create an African model. Perhaps there could be some sort of prizes directed to young people that are trying to come with a model that is, yes, take some of what other countries are using that could be successful, that could be implemented into Africa, and yet also that can be used and combined with, African knowledge and African traditions, and, to come up with a way that the African model can be also exported to the world. So I think that could be probably an interesting thing. And also universities and donors try to not only meet the basic needs, which are extremely important, but to go beyond and to try to focus on young people and try to invest in education, but also to try to be more creative. And, that could be an interesting thing in my point of view. I don't know if it's feasible, but...
So just let me ask, your question would be?
If you think that perhaps could be feasible to try to engage the private sector through perhaps trying to find a combination, a link with the civil society, like NGOs, for instance, not only dedicated to certain programs, but trying to take it to a further step and try to link and have a trigger to economy. That's my question, and I don't know if it's feasible, it's just an idea.
Ms. Halima, if you could deal with the cash flight situation, and then if you could dovetail into...
Yes, I would also. Thank you very much, and thank you for very interesting comments. And first of all, before I go to capital flights, I will talk about entrepreneurship. I think I would like us to go from this meeting with the idea, it's like gender mainstreaming. You don't talk of policies like it's a homogeneous. You have women who have nothing, you have women in parliament, you have ministerial. How you intervene is different. So it's the same as entrepreneurship. If you have the small-scale business person, what they would need is access probably to finance. And then you have SMEs, what they would need is access to information, markets, etc., for example. So I would really like to know that we differentiate between different kind of entrepreneurs that and what is it they are doing, need, etc. On the question of capital flights, this is linked actually to the World Bank policies of structural adjustment. You remember they asked us to deregulate. That's how it's easy to take money out of Africa. This, the Asian economies did not do. But I think what we get out of the financial crisis is to show that regulation, to some extent, not burdensome. There has to be balance between regulation and burdensome regulation. That would be very important. Because what happens, money is, they call it fly by night. It comes and it goes without making an impact into the economy. So how does this money make a difference? And I would like to talk a little bit also about indigenous knowledge, etc. it's not even to promote, the word is to protect, because we have the indigenous knowledge and plans. What has happened, we have multinational companies coming in without disclosure and without sharing of benefits. What we are trying to negotiate in the WTO, in the TRIPS agreement, trade-related intellectual property rights, is to have disclosure. If they get a plant, you know, I don't know how to say this. I'm going to say it the way I will say it anyway. You have a European coming to a small village, very nice, and African culture, brother, you open your door, and this tree, Mwarubaine, cures malaria before. Then this is used without sharing of benefits. So basically what we need is to protect this knowledge. And so there's disclosure where this knowledge came from, and then the sharing of benefits. I also wanted to talk about...
if I may, just for brevity of time, because we virtually have run over, what I would do at this particular time is...
The civil society, could I just do that?
If we'll give it to someone else, because what I like to do is we virtually, again with time, these discussions become very engaging. But what I like to do is, let's have closing comments, but in the closing comments, I'll preface it with one question. If you can be brief, we try to get your closing comments and the answer to the question in really at this particular time, 1 ICD minute. So we do have 1 ICD measuring minute. So at least we can begin to have some parallel of standardization. So I'll start over with South Africa. In South Africa, since the question came in from, we'll take the one on the question you brought about with the internecine conflicts and others. How does this affect the development of economies, entrepreneurship, etc.? If you can answer that, and also your closing comments in regards to the question of the supranational economic unions and entrepreneurship, but much more as a key to stabilizing African economies and promoting prosperity. So in your answer, you would actually be talking whether it is or it is not, but try to just make that concise within 1 minute.
Okay, I mean, it is a fair point to say that when you have conflicts, the opportunity of trading with one another becomes more difficult. But when if you, for example, look at the Southern African region, where in terms of SADC, I mean, even though, for example, our traditional trading partners are in the north, in the Europeans and the Americans, but we still trade quite substantially amongst ourselves also. Whilst it's a trade within our region is flourishing, even though it may not be as large as our traditional markets, but we still trade with one another. But whereas I suppose in other parts of the continent, I take your point that yes, domestic conflicts and would act as an obstacle to further trade relations and economic integration. Well, and just in terms of my final statement on this, I think, as my colleague was saying, I mean, as Africans, I don't think we are at that stage yet where we're ready to cede our national sovereignty to a supranational body. But we do recognize that we have to act as a collective, whether at the regional level and also at the continental level. In our negotiating with like the EU and other supranational bodies, there's a need for Africans to act together in a collective. Doesn't mean we cede our national sovereignty, but there is a recognition that we have to act as a collective in negotiating better terms for African countries. So yeah, and in terms of entrepreneurship, it's a key for both South Africa and for African countries, not only for survival but also for future development. There's a need to nurture these entrepreneurs in Africa, and I'm sure that in coming years that's what African countries will be focusing on.
Daniel, I'll go straight to you. Free movement of people, you're much familiar with it in Europe, how it works. You've also been on the ground in Africa, so as closing statements, if you can speak to that as it relates to Africa, and also your closing statements to the subject matter.
Of course, I think it's highly beneficial. I mean, an African friend of mine a couple of years back came to, I think it was the Netherlands, and went to France, if I remember correctly, and was totally surprised that I, as a Kenyan at that time, need a visa to go to Uganda a couple of years ago. I mean, nowadays, at least thanks to the benefits of the East African community, that rule is no longer there to my knowledge. Of course, it helps a lot. I mean, in terms also, people can then go for education in other countries and can return to their native country and bring in their skills. As far as trade is concerned, I think also all kinds of exchange across borders help to increase the knowledge of any given country. So you learn more best practice models, for instance. So I think, as Europe has shown, it's not the end of the world. I mean, when the Schengen Treaty was signed, that was the legal basis for the opening of the borders here. In Germany, a lot of people said more or less this is the end of the world because thousands of gangsters are going to come into Germany. They will take whatever they have, they'll run across the border, and then that's it. And the country will be empty. And it didn't happen. I mean, it is true that we have in certain regions a higher crime rate, but it does not mean that we have joined the Wild West now. It's still manageable. So I think this kind of fear is more or less baseless, particularly because those people that want to cross African borders cross them anyway today. I mean, for instance, if people are afraid, say, if we cross the border, we'll have an influx of refugees, you will have this influx because many countries have borders that are very long, that cannot be patrolled, that cannot be controlled. Refugees are coming anyway, so there's no reason. So I think, yes, it would help a lot for economic integration, also for other, as far as other topics are concerned, to open the borders and to follow that European model.
Dr. Kennedy, to engage the private sector through the civil society, and also your closing statements.
Well, engaging the civil society, I like that way of thinking. It's very new, but it has its own challenges which needs to be researched upon. Which the precondition which you have is that the private sector are serving the interests of the people. But unfortunately, I always call it the triple rulers hypothesis. In some countries, you have the politicians own NGOs, and the NGOs and the same politicians owns business. So when you get to the politics and the rule making, he sends you to his NGOs, and when you go to his NGOs, you get to his business. So when you have the rider and the horse at the same time, when you have it, it makes no difference. So, but in finding a way in which we have the screening and credible NGOs pro-development, it's very important. This is what has been called in the past years participatory system. But I think we are also going to have a big problem because what NGOs are all about, they are complaints NGOs, complaining against the government or complaining against the business. There you have two problems to solve. How do we engage the government to even negotiate with the NGOs, where the NGOs is being paid by donors from the West, and to fight on humanitarian or human rights issues. So we have to find to solve this three-way conflict management system. But I think regarding to our topic, we have now realized that supranational union is a precondition for economic development. Entrepreneurship, which is based on African unique selling point. I say unique selling point here is because the African continent is the missing link of the global economy, which implies we have a lot of products, innovative products to produce and contribute to the global development.
Ms. Halima, if you may, your closing statements.
Thank you. I'll talk a little bit also about civil society participation in private sector.
If I may, you have
half a second. All right, thank you. It's actually happening. If you have, for example, I will link with economic partnership agreement. I used to work on economic partnership agreements as well. You have something, I'll give an example of East Africa. For example, Kenya, you have National Committee on WTO, where you have the private sector and you have the civil society. Since I have half a minute, I will talk about the complaining NGOs. I will call them entrepreneurs. They have to make money as well. Especially in Europe, since they have no jobs and you come to Europe as a diaspora, what do you do? Entrepreneurship. Thank you.
Thank you. John, I would like to come in closing again. We're talking about stabilizing African prosperity, so definitely, rather than define prosperity, the last speaker or the last presenter spoke about creating an African model, and I'd like the last two of you in your closing statements to speak to that.
Yes, I think Africa needs successful entrepreneurs, on every level, because there is an African model. My father used to say, as an African, you will never be rich, because if you are rich, you have more responsibility for your people. So that means an successful African entrepreneur is also responsible for many people, and I think that is typical for Africa, and is really a difference for the society here. That means if I am lucky, if I am successful as an entrepreneur, I can also do much for the country. And I really think, and that could be an input also from the diaspora, people who are trained here, studied here, that we also see it is very important that we produce something in Africa. And I call that in my presentation a primary industry. That means we really start, and I really don't talk about South Africa, but really in other countries, that we produce something, and this is what I would call really an entrepreneurship, and we need successful entrepreneurs. Thank you.
And Dr. Kharziel, in closing, I again would like to speak to the fact of the African model, but since you touched on the flaw in the human being, do you think, in closing, as your statements, that prosperity will have to be redefined, that Africa would have to look at being entrepreneurs and bringing value to their human ecology rather than bringing value to inanimate things, and that would be a key of redefining prosperity as a people-to-people value and excellence, which would then form the foundation? Or should we still continue in the models of just creating inanimate goods and services at the expense of people, value, and development, in creating an African model?
Thank you. To the last point, absolutely not. We can't. This is a new model, and I would like to
you have 1 minute.
Complete my brother's question about what model should we use. That's exactly what our Institute of Regenerative Truth are preparing to contribute. We're actually experimenting with a new socio-economic ideal. I stayed intentionally at the very foundation of this economic scenario because, again, we must have a new economic philosophy. It has to be one that is indigenous and organic to who we are. That's very, very, very important. 3 points, 3 salient points. The system has to have contentment. We see where you talked about the gap between the African and the European. You used Bill Gates as an example, and that's a matter of fact. The 3 men at Microsoft have more money than all Africa combined. Now, that is the model of success for what could be called democratic capitalism. Lately, we've seen the disappearance or the eradication of the so-called middle class. That is not happenstance. That is not something that's occurring as a result of someone not knowing what they're doing. That is a very intentional, orchestrated plan, because capitalism, market capitalism, free enterprise, is based on only 2 elements: super rich, super poor.
Okay, let me do, since you see that this can be further expanded, let me now close you in 10 seconds if you can sum this up, because we do have the next, we've actually run into the next scheduled program, which is right behind this, and again, just for time balance. So for those of you who want the extra bit, it gives you an opportunity to have a conversation with Dr. Kharziel. So you already see where he's going. So in 10 seconds, if you can kindly sum this up, because now we're running into the logistics of time, please.
Okay, thank you. And finally, it must be earth-friendly. It has to be harmonious with the ecological systems of the earth, its biosystems, and you could say the diversity of all life. This new entrepreneur, I'm for men being rich and people being rich, countries being rich, but it must be with honor. A good entrepreneur will become wealthy, but with honor. Thank you.
And I'd like all of you to please thank our esteemed panel, Mrs. Halima, Daniel Pelz, Dr. Kennedy, Dr. Ben Yehuda, and Mr. Chetty. If you can give them on my behalf a big round of applause, please. And also to yourselves, if you can give a big round of applause. And finally, we do have a surprise. We're getting ready to go straight into our next phase, but I hear that we have a surprise. Would you bring it on?
Actually, would it be possible to do a group photo with everyone? Just now, just before a very short break. And also, I think it's a participant's birthday today, if I'm not mistaken, Miss Oshoa. So everyone, maybe another round of applause. Maybe we can put you in the middle of the group picture.
Happy birthday. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Miss Halima. Happy birthday to you. Hip, 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 hip.